Welcome back. I'm Joe.
Hey everyone, Sunny here. Today we're sorting through a stack of sources we've got. Laws, analyses, investigation reports, news clips.
Yeah, a real mix.
And we're using them to unpack a really thorny topic. China's national intelligence law, Chinese students studying here in the U.S., and these concerns about academic espionage, especially at places like Harvard.
It's definitely complex. You've got legal arguments, security fears, actual incidents, and some pretty significant disagreements. Our job today is just to lay out what these sources say, stick to the facts presented, and understand the different angles.
Okay, so let's dive in. The absolute core of this, according to pretty much all the sources, seems to be China's 2017 National Intelligence Law, specifically Article 7.
Article 7, yes, that's the one everyone points to. It says, citizens and organizations must support, assist, and cooperate with state intelligence work. It's quite explicit.
And for the U.S. intelligence folks, the FBI, CIA, this isn't just like suggested reading.
Not at all. Their take, as presented in the sources, is that this law gives the Chinese government a legal hook, a way to potentially compel their citizens, including students studying abroad, to gather intelligence for them.
And intelligence work? That sounds pretty broad. How wide-ranging do the sources say that is?
Well, the U.S. analysts cited seem to think it's potentially huge. We're talking sensitive tech AI, quantum computing, biomedicine, but also maybe economic info, basically anything Beijing might see as strategically important.
But it's not a settled interpretation, is it? The sources show some debate there.
Right. You see mentions of some Chinese scholars arguing it's mainly defensive, protecting China's own security.
But the U.S. view is different.
Yeah, the U.S. analysts quoted tend to see Article 7 as enabling more active, maybe even offensive, intelligence gathering. And there's even a mention, I think, in that Manheimer-Swardling report about uncertainty over whether China can legally enforce this law outside its borders. So it's murky.
Okay, so you have this law, this interpretation. Where does it actually connect with U.S. universities? The sources seem to paint them as quite vulnerable, almost soft targets.
And the why is pretty clear from the documents.
Yeah.
These places, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, the big research hubs, they're working on the exact kinds of cutting-edge science and tech that the sources say China is focused on acquiring.
AI, quantum, biotech.
Exactly. And the whole culture of academia openness, sharing research, international collaboration, which is normally a huge strength,
becomes a potential vulnerability in this context.
That's the argument presented, yes.
Yeah.
Easy access to papers, seminars, conversations.
Let's put some numbers on this. The sources highlight Harvard quite a bit.
They do. Harvard in 2024 had about 16,800 international students. And around 20% of those, the largest single group, were from China. That's what, roughly 1,300, 1,400 students?
Significant numbers. And Stanford.
Also large numbers, cited around 1,100 or so Chinese students. And the sources make a point that some are funded by the China Scholarship Council, the CSC.
And that matters because,
well, according to the sources, CSC scholars may have requirements to report back to Chinese consulates. And U.S. intelligence apparently views that connection with suspicion.
we also see FBI Director Wray quoted quite a bit in these materials.
Yes, warning about China using non-traditional collectors. He specifically mentions universities, students, researchers. He even uses that phrase, one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history, talking about potential IP theft.
Which naturally leads to the question, okay, the concern is there, the law is there. What actual evidence or specific cases do the sources point to?
Right. Let's look at the examples provided. The Charles Lieber case at Harvard gets a lot of attention.
The chemistry chair, right.
That's him. His conviction wasn't for espionage directly, but for lying about his involvement in China's Thousand Talents plan, hiding funding from Wuhan University of Technology, setting up a lab there. The sources frame it as a major example of the risks of these undisclosed foreign ties.
Okay, what else? There was the student in Illinois.
Ji-Cho Kwon, an engineering student at Illinois Tech, later joined the U.S. Army Reserve. He was convicted of acting as an illegal agent for China's Ministry of State Security.
What was he accused of doing?
Gathering background info, basically profiles, on U.S. citizens, scientists, engineers who might be potential recruits for Chinese intelligence.
And then there was that report from Stanford. It sounded quite alarming.
Yes, the Stanford Review report from 2025. It alleged that someone claiming to be a CCP agent contacted students online trying to get research info.
And used threats.
That was the most disturbing part of the allegation, yes. Threats against the students' families back in China if they didn't cooperate. Now, it's presented as an allegation in a student publication, but it's cited as an example of potential coercion.
The sources also briefly mention a few others, something about missile tech at UCLA, Apple secrets in Ohio, a PLA lieutenant hiding their identity at BU.
Right. Small snippets of other cases. And this is really crucial, the sources are quite clear on this while these cases exist and are presented as proof of potential risk.
They don't show that most Chinese students are spies.
Exactly. The sources explicitly state there's a lack of broad evidence for systematic, widespread espionage by the general population of Chinese students. It's more about these individual cases and the potential for coercion.
That potential for pressure on families back home seems key. The Amnesty International report, that Stanford Review piece, they highlight that as a real factor.
It definitely complicates the picture. Even if a student has no intention of spying, that pressure could be immense.
Which brings us to that central, really controversial question the sources wrestle with. Is welcoming Chinese students essentially inviting spies, given the law and these potential pressures?
And you see two very different viewpoints in the materials.
Yeah.
On one side, you have the U.S. security perspective, the FBI, CIA, some politicians.
Their view seems to be that the law makes every Chinese citizen a potential intelligence asset, whether they want to be or not.
Pretty much. They see it as a systemic risk built into Chinese law. That's why you see FBI warnings to universities, talk in Congress about tightening visa rules, even ideas floated like a Stop CCP Visas Act.
But then you have the academic world pushing back hard.
Very hard. Figures like Columbia's President Lee Bollinger are quoted expressing serious concerns. They worry that treating all Chinese students and scholars with suspicion will damage academic freedom, hinder vital research, and inevitably lead to racial profiling.
Discrimination based on origin, basically.
Yes. And you have scholars like James Millward from Georgetown quoted arguing the threat is overblown, that these are isolated cases not representative of the vast majority of students.
And Professor Margaret Lewis brings up the shadow of the China Initiative, right?
Yeah, the fear that these policies could repeat the mistakes of that program, which faced criticism for unfairly targeting researchers of Chinese descent, sometimes ruining careers based on suspicion rather than solid evidence of spying.
So universities are caught in the middle of this tension described in the sources. What's the real-world impact on their research, on academic freedom?
It's a massive challenge. On one hand, they're doing sensitive, cutting-edge research that, according to the sources, is targeted. They have security obligations.
But their whole model is based on openness and international exchange. You can't have groundbreaking science in a locked box.
Exactly. And the sources mention how previous government crackdowns, like NIH looking into undisclosed foreign funding, did find some compliance issues, but also create a real chill, a lot of fear and resentment in the research community.
So we've seen government responses mention the China Initiative, visa limits from DHS, even specific actions against universities like Harvard were attempted based on the sources.
And universities like Harvard and Stanford are quoted saying, essentially, we cooperate with law enforcement, but we must distinguish between the actions of the Chinese state and individual students or scholars to avoid discrimination.
Let's zoom back in on Harvard since it features so prominently in the sources.
It's a key example. Partly because it's Harvard top-tier research prestige, and partly because of those numbers we mentioned, the large Chinese student population.
The sources also bring up funding. Harvard receives a lot of foreign money, over $1 billion mentioned, some specifically from China, like a big donation from Ronnie Chan.
And while the sources don't draw a direct line saying this donation equals security risk, they do sort of imply that significant foreign funding could raise questions about institutional independence or potential influence down the line. It's floated as a concern.
And of course, the Lieber case happened right there, a Harvard department chair. It's the most direct example tied to the university in these materials.
Absolutely. And more recently, there's that 2024 congressional investigation the sources discuss. It's looking into Harvard's alleged links with Chinese universities tied to the military and even training programs reportedly involving the XPCC.
The Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, the group sanctioned by the U.S.?
That's the one. So Congress framing those connections as a potential national security concern based on the sources?
But Harvard's position, as quoted from interim President Alan Garber in 2025,
was basically asserting independence, upholding constitutional rights, but also stating they comply with the law, a careful balancing act in their public statements.
Okay, so let's pull this all together. Why should you, listening right now, care about this complex web of laws, espionage concerns, and academic debate?
Well, it's not just abstract geopolitics. It touches on U.S. national security, definitely, but also the future of science and innovation. The research happening at these universities affects everyone.
And academic freedom, how we treat international students, the risk of discrimination, it gets pretty fundamental.
Right. And the news you see about this is often, let's be honest, really polarized. Looking at the sources helps you see the different pieces, the legal basis for concern in China's law, the specific examples the FBI points to.
But also the very real warnings from universities about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, about the dangers of suspicion based on nationality.
It's a situation with genuine risks and genuine potential for harmful overreaction. No easy answers presented here.
So we've covered the law's potential reach, why universities are focal points, the specific cases cited,
And that intense debate between security concerns and academic values, including the risk of discrimination.
and we've seen how Harvard sits right in the crosshairs of many of these issues, according to the source material.
What we're left with, based purely on these sources, is this. You have a Chinese law that U.S. intelligence interprets as a tool for coercion. You have documented cases of pressure on families and some individuals engaging in illicit activities.
But at the same time, the sources stress there isn't evidence that most students are involved.
Which leaves everyone grappling with this incredibly tough question. How do you protect genuinely sensitive research and national security without shutting down the international collaboration that drives scientific progress, and without unfairly targeting an entire group of people based on their origin? Finding that balance. Well, the sources suggest everyone is still trying to figure that out. We'll be right back. I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
That's the relationship between Harvard University and China.
It feels like you can't avoid hearing about it, especially with the U.S. government really, taking a much closer look.
Yeah, the scrutiny has definitely ramped up.
And it's not just one thing, is it? It's multifaceted. We're talking academic partnerships.
Big money donations.
Huge donations. And of course, the large number of Chinese students studying there. And this big question. Has Harvard somehow become this anti-American base that some people are claiming?
Let's try and get to the bottom of it. Look at the facts.
Okay, so maybe the place to start is with the Trump administration, because they really started putting the pressure on Harvard, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Particularly in his second term, starting early 2025, there was a real focus on elite universities like Harvard.
And why was that? What were the stated reasons?
Well, the sources point to a few key things. First, there was this strong belief in the administration that places like Harvard were dominated by liberal ideology.
Right, and sort of hostile territory for conservative views.
Exactly, and that led to actions like freezing funding. Billions.
Oh, $4 billion. Wow, that's not pocket change.
Not at all. It was explicitly linked to accusations of, quote, leftist censorship, a huge financial lever being pulled.
Okay, so ideology was one part. What else?
Then you had the really serious fallout from the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack.
Ah, yes.
The administration accused Harvard of failing to protect Jewish and pro-Israel students, citing alleged civil rights violations due to anti-Semitism on campus.
And that whole controversy around the then-president Claudine Gay and her congressional testimony, that really fueled the fire, didn't it?
It absolutely did. Her comment about whether calls for the genocide of Jews violated Harvard's code of conduct, saying it depends on the context, caused a huge backlash.
Yeah, I remember that. It seemed to confirm, for some critics, that Harvard wasn't taking the issue seriously enough.
Right. And alongside all this, Harvard was also pushing back against government demands.
On things like admissions, curriculum.
Exactly. Admissions, curriculum, hiring. Harvard's position was basically, look, we'll comply with the law, but we need to maintain our academic independence.
So kind of a standoff situation developing.
You can certainly see it that way. The government pushing, Harvard resisting.
And the government didn't just leave it there, did they?
No. The response was pretty drastic. In May 2025, there was that attempt to ban Harvard from admitting any new international students.
Whoa, all international students. That's a massive step.
It was seen as a major escalation, a direct consequence of Harvard's resistance.
But it didn't stick, right?
Correct. The sources say a federal judge stepped in and put a temporary block on that ban.
Okay, wow. So that sets the stage for the government pressure. Now, let's shift to Harvard's actual ties with China. These aren't new, are they?
No, not at all. Harvard has a long history of academic and research cooperation with China.
Like partnerships with specific universities over there.
Yeah. Big names. Tsinghua University, Zhejiang University, Huazhong University of Science and Technology. Quite a few.
And some of these projects were even funded by the U.S. government.
That's a really interesting point the sources raise. Some collaborations actually received funding from the U.S. Department of Defense.
Wait, the DoD funding joint projects between Harvard and Chinese universities? That sounds, well, complicated now.
Harvard has received, let's just say, substantial donations from China over the years. The big one often cited is the $350 million donation back in 2014.
$350 million
Yeah.
From one donation.
Yep, from Ronnie Chan, a businessman with ties to the Chinese government. And that donation led to the renaming of the Harvard School of Public Health.
The T.H. Chan School of Public Health.
Right, exactly. And beyond just the name, you have to ask, does a donation that large subtly influence research priorities over time, even without explicit strings attached?
It's a valid question. And that wasn't an isolated case, was it?
No. The sources state that since 2012, Harvard has accepted over $1.1 billion in foreign funds overall.
Over $1 billion.
Yes, and a significant chunk of that came from China. That sheer scale inevitably raises concerns about potential influence on research agendas, academic freedom.
Yeah, does the money come with, like, unspoken expectations, even if nothing's written down?
That's the worry. It's difficult to prove, but the potential for self-censorship or steering research towards less sensitive topics is a concern that gets raised.
Now, what about the stories surrounding Xi Jinping's daughter? That often gets brought up in these discussions.
Right, Xi Mingze. She attended Harvard from 2010 to 2014, apparently under a pseudonym.
And there's speculation about special treatment or donations linked to her being there?
There is speculation, yes. But the sources are clear. Harvard keeps admissions and specific donor information private. So there's no concrete evidence publicly available to back up claims of special treatment or specific quid pro quo donations related to her attendance.
So more smoke than fire on that particular point, based on what we know.
Seems that way.
Yeah.
Interesting context, but maybe not a central piece of evidence for undue influence.
Got it. Okay, so we've got the research links, the financial ties. What about the students themselves? There are a lot of Chinese students at Harvard, right?
A significant number. They make up the largest group of international students there.
How many are we talking?
As of 2024, it was around 1/5 of the entire foreign student body.
1 in 5 international students. Wow.
And remember that attempted international student ban we talked about? That would have potentially affected about 6,800 students across Harvard. And nearly 20% of those, so well over 1,000, would have been Chinese students.
So that ban wasn't just some abstract policy move. It had real potential consequences for thousands of students, including many from China.
Absolutely. A direct impact on individuals' lives and education paths.
Okay, this brings us back to that central, really loaded question. This claim that Harvard has become an anti-American base.
Yeah.
Where does that specific accusation come from?
Primarily, it comes from critics in the U.S. Congress and certain government officials.
Are they pointing to specific evidence?
A key piece often cited is the 2024 investigation by the House Select Committee on the CCP. They looked specifically at how Harvard handled certain incidents on campus involving China.
Like protests?
Exactly. There was an incident in April 2024 during a speech by the Chinese ambassador. A student protested against the CCP.
Okay.
And was physically removed from the event by another student, reportedly someone with pro-CCP views.
Right. And the committee's issue was with Harvard's response.
Yes. The committee's findings suggested that Harvard took disciplinary action against the protesting student, but not necessarily against the student who physically removed them.
So the interpretation was that Harvard was, protecting the ambassador or CCP sensitivities over free speech.
That was certainly the interpretation highlighted by the committee and other critics. It was presented as evidence of Harvard potentially yielding to CCP influence.
That does sound concerning if that's the full picture. But the sources also caution against jumping to conclusions, right? Is there actually direct proof Harvard is infiltrated or acting as an anti-American base?
That's the counterargument. The sources emphasize that direct evidence of Harvard being systematically compromised or acting as a base against U.S. interests is, lacking.
So a lot of circumstantial evidence and interpretation of specific incidents?
Largely, yes. And some argue these accusations are heavily influenced by the broader political tensions between the U.S. and China. using Harvard as a sort of proxy battleground.
Couldn't Harvard's handling of that protest just be seen as, trying to maintain order at a sensitive diplomatic event rather than siding with the CCP? It seems like a fine line.
It is a very fine line, and interpreting intent is always tricky. There's also the perspective that these collaborations, the students, the research, they could actually be mutually beneficial.
How so?
Well, the U.S. potentially gains from the research outcomes, economic activity, and maintaining influence through its top universities. The fact that people from China still want to come to Harvard suggests it retains significant global prestige, not that it's purely anti-American.
So it's a sign of American soft power, in a way.
You could argue that, but, and this is crucial, that doesn't negate the risks. The potential for espionage, intellectual property issues, and the ethical dimension, especially concerning human rights. Those risks are very real.
Like that XPCC training connection we discussed earlier, that's a concrete example of where collaboration crossed into problematic territory.
Precisely. It underscores the need for vigilance and clear ethical guidelines.
Okay, let's quickly recap some of the key incidents again. We mentioned Claudine Gay's testimony and resignation.
Yes, that definitely intensified the pressure and scrutiny on Harvard regarding anti-Semitism and its leadership.
And the attempted international student ban, Harvard suing over that.
Right, showing Harvard pushing back legally against direct government intervention.
Then there's the Charles Lieber case. That seems really important.
Very significant. The former chair of chemistry convicted for hiding his ties to China's 1,000 Talents program and unreported income from Chinese sources, including work setting up a lab in Wuhan.
The 1,000 Talents program.
Yeah.
That's the one aimed at recruiting scientists, right?
Often raises spying concerns.
Exactly. Lieber's case became a kind of poster child for concerns about lack of transparency and potential academic espionage within these U.S.-China research links.
And he actually moved to China afterwards.
Yes, he relocated to China and is now working there as a professor. It really underscored the concerns for many observers.
Wow. Okay. And finally, that protest incident during the ambassador's speech in April 2024.
Yes, that's repeatedly used by critics as an example of Harvard allegedly prioritizing CCP relations over free expression. So, faced with all this, the government pressure, the Lieber case, the protest fallout, how is Harvard officially responding?
Their main message, according to the sources, is a strong defense of their independence and academic freedom.
Pushing back against government interference.
Yes. The university president made a statement around April 2025, emphasizing they'd comply with the law, but vigorously uphold their rights to manage their own affairs, admissions, curriculum, research.
And they feel these actions are harmful beyond just Harvard.
They argue it creates a chilling effect, potentially endangering international students and scholars, and serving as a warning that could deter collaboration and exchange.
Sort of this isn't just about us, it's about the openness of American higher education argument.
That seems to be the core of their public stance. It frames the issue around academic freedom versus national security concerns.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, it really is an incredibly tangled web, isn't it?
It really is. You've got the intense government scrutiny driven by ideological battles, genuine security worries, and the fallout from specific incidents like the anti-Semitism concerns.
Then you have Harvard's perspective defending its longstanding ties with China, its academic freedom, while facing these accusations.
And the evidence for the most extreme claim that Harvard is an anti-American base seems, well, inconclusive at best. There are definitely worrying connections and incidents, but attributing a deliberate anti-American motive to the entire institution seems like a stretch based on the available public information.
Right. It feels more like a complex mix of institutional inertia, the pursuit of funding and global prestige, genuine academic collaboration, and maybe some serious blind spots or missteps along the way, all happening under a geopolitical microscope.
That's a good way to put it. It's a highly controversial situation, touching on national security, academic freedom, human rights, international relations. A real balancing act.
Trying to weigh the benefits of global engagement against some very clear risks.
Absolutely. Which really leaves us, and you, the listener, with a crucial question to ponder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Given how interconnected global research and education are now, how should institutions like Harvard navigate these incredibly complex international partnerships? How do you balance openness and collaboration with safeguarding national interests and maintaining academic integrity?
That is the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? Or maybe the $1,000,000,000 question in this case. Definitely a lot to think about.
For sure.
And well, thanks for helping us unpack all of that today. It's a lot to take in.
My pleasure. It's an important topic.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, if you found this deep dive valuable, please do subscribe to the deep dive wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss our next one.
Yeah, definitely hit that follow button.
Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.